He did David, the marble block that he took to make David with had been a stone that was rejected by a couple of different artists. They said it was the marble wasn't right, it had too many blemishes, too many imperfections, and he was able to take out of that marble, that statue, and the close-up of it, it's almost photo real how intricate all that is, and the work of it. He talked about, Michelangelo, that every block of stone has a statue inside it, and it's the task of the sculptor to discover it. He says, I saw an angel in the marble, and I kept carving until I set him free. After he had been the Pope's personal artist for several years, had worked at the Vatican, had done a lot of sculptures and a lot of famous things, the Pope asked him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The bottom right there is the most famous part of it, in the middle, the creation of Adam, but there's all sorts of paintings on it. And he didn't want to do it. He resisted pretty hard the Pope telling him to do it. He didn't think he was a painter as much as a sculptor. This is like his second best effort here on the bottom right. And it stood the test for a long time. People now will say about Michelangelo that he might have been the greatest artist who ever lived because of the things that he created and how they've still endured. It said that the project on the Sistine Chapel, again, the bottom right there, is it took 4 years. He built his own scaffolding for it. The myth of it says he was on his back for most of it. Most of it wasn't on his back. Most of it he was standing and painting above his head the way he had it set up. And so a lot of injuries came out of it. He developed some arthritis and he had a goiter, and there was a lot. His hips gave him trouble the rest of his life. His back gave him trouble the rest of his life. 4 years of painting upside down. The paint was in his eyes, and he was breathing all that stuff for 4 years. All those things had an effect on his health. But it was a masterpiece at the end. And that picture of it, of him suffering for his art, I think is an interesting picture. That idea that it's costing him something, blood and sweat and tears for 4 years to produce this big thing. And the statues certainly too. I mean, all that time invested, where nobody sees what you're doing and you're just creating and you're trying to bring something out of nothing. All there's right now is a rock, but I'm trying to bring something out of it. And it's all illustrative for me to think about how God is and how I wanted to get into my sermon here today, because the Bible pictures God as an artist in a couple of different passages, but the one I'm most fond of is this one. It's in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. It says, we're God's masterpiece. Now, the NIV, I think, says his workmanship. Some other translations will use workmanship too, or piece of work. But I like the idea of masterpiece that the Living Bible talks about there, that when God has us in mind, it's like Michelangelo looking at the stone there, right? And there's a statue and there's an angel inside of it. I just got to bring it out. And so he's all the time sculpting on us and creating us. I had a friend a long time ago who was told frequently by his parents from the time he was born, I think he may still be getting told by his parents if they're still alive, that he was an accident, that he wasn't planned. I don't know psychologically what that does to you to hear that your whole life. I would think eventually it starts to do some damage. But they told him that his whole life. And you may have been an accident as far as your parents were concerned. They didn't plan to have you. But this verse says you were never an accident to God. That he had things in mind for you before you ever came along. And that you're his work of art. That God is constantly sculpting and creating and trying to build something out of you and out of your life. Now the trouble, again, you think about Michelangelo with the stone that nobody else wanted. He's going to bring some great statue out of it. Is that we have a tendency to not be easy to work with. I mean, we're not necessarily. I mean, you can be a person who's really rock solid for God for 2 or 3 years, and then take 2 or 3 years where you're not rock solid, where you're kind of going a whole different direction, or where you're running away from God as hard as you can. Sometimes we give God 9 out of 10 things. Okay, God, I'll do this and this and this, but this one thing here, I'm going to do what I want to do on this. I'm not going to compromise on that. And again, the one thing can be the thing that unties the whole knot. Sometimes we can give God lip service. And when we're here in church, we present a pretty good image. When we're away from here, we're a whole different person. And we've gotten used to that. Just that we're one person when we're with God and somebody else when we're not. But this picture that God can take a person's life and make them something. Man, that's what this is all about. And certainly the people I'm speaking to online here, and if you're new to our church, I mean, that's the big message that I want you to get, that life is possible, right? I mean, that a regular person can be transformed by God's grace. In fact, that's his agenda. Now, it should be mentioned that when people complain about the church, when people complain about Christians, this is normally the thing they pick at. They say they're this, but they're not. They pretend to be all righteous, but they're just like the rest of us. They say that, and there's some truth to it. There's some truth to it. That's why it hurts when somebody says that. And we see it, right? Somebody who we elevate to a high position, maybe they're preaching or they're a leader in the church or they're a teacher, and then all this ugliness comes out, later on about them. Or maybe it's not that at all. It can be well, you see it, right? And I've mentioned it before, I'm sure, in a sermon, but a grumpy young man joins the church, and 70 years later, we have a grumpy old man at the church. They never changed at all. Partly it's a result of what I do for a living, but I have found that some of the meanest people I've ever known were Christians. And I understand why people will take little shots at the church about it. It's fair game, because we talk this way, like the verse behind me. We talk this way. This is what God wants out of us, that God is building us into something else. But we're hard to work with. And sometimes we don't fully give God the whole deal. There's some debate about that amongst theologians, about how much of it is up to God and how much of it's up to you. There are some people who believe that God does everything. You can't do anything about it, that you just are there, and if you feel inspired, it's because God gave you inspiration. If you feel like doing something, it's because God gave you that, and you never do anything with it. You just live your life, and if God wants to do something with you, he will. There's other people who kind of put more of the weight on us, and they say it's mostly about us, that God is the same to everybody, but if you really want it, then you'll come grab a hold of it, and God will give it back, but you've got to want it. And I wonder if the truth is probably somewhere between those things, that God is the one who provides the gasoline, but if you're not putting yourself in the car, if you're not turning the key, if you're not making yourself available, I don't know what good that fuel does. I don't know what good that power does. If you're not putting yourself in a position to get it, then I don't know what God, I don't know. It's a confusing thing. There's a hymn that talks about that. I was going to have you sing just the first verse with me. We'll see how this goes. If it's any comfort to you, the only one they'll hear online is me, which it'll be awful for me, but that's okay. I want to sing it with you. So it's Have Thine Own Way. We're just going to sing the first verse of it, okay? And I'll help you. The first part is Have Thine Own Way, Lord, have Thine own way. So follow me best you can. Have Thine own way, Lord. Have Thine own way. Thou art the potter, I'm the clay. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Make me and mold me. Make me and mold me after Thy will. After Thy will. While I'm yielded. While I'm waiting. Am waiting. Yielded and still. Yielded and still. I won't make you sing the whole thing again because I messed it up. But that last part's the important part. While I'm waiting and yielded, right? I mean, God's doing it. Make me and mold me, but I'm yielded. I'm going to let you have the keys to the car, God. I'm going to let you have the control over this thing for a while and take us where we need to go. And if you do that, I believe God still is in the business of changing hearts and changing lives and making people better. When I was trying to think about what story I wanted to use in the Bible to illustrate some of this, there were some really obvious choices that sprung to mind, but I kept coming back to one story that's pretty hard. And it's considered by people who study such things to be one of the hardest stories about Jesus in the Bible. I don't think I've ever preached on it because it is kind of tricky. It's hard to explain, and I'm not sure I'll do a great job. I'm going to try to do a good job, but I don't know. Who knows? We'll see. But it's kind of because it presents a picture of Jesus that's not normal. And part of that, by the way, is because Jesus is complicated. And I wouldn't like to think of it that way, but he's got personality. He's his own. I mean, he's not like a cartoon character. So part of it's that. But it's a complicated story because it doesn't seem like how Jesus normally goes. And it's in Matthew chapter 15. And I'm just going to read the story to you, and we'll talk about it as we go. But I want you to pay a special attention to the person who's talking to Jesus and how they react. That's where we come in. We got to have we'll get to it. It says, Jesus, leaving that place, went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And if you don't know your Middle Eastern, ancient Middle Eastern geography, if this square here is Israel, and you sort of know where Israel is, the Mediterranean Sea is right here, and go back here to Italy, and so Israel's here. Tyre and Sidon are two cities that are right above Israel. It's kind of a rectangle country. They're right above Israel, and they're right on the beach. And it's maybe possible that Jesus went to these places because they're on the beach. You know, he's been arguing right before this with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so to get away from them, he goes out of the country, leaves Israel, and goes to these two places, Tyre and Sidon, around the beach. And maybe went for the same reason you might go to the beach. You know, just sitting on the ocean, the waves coming in, it kind of makes you feel, you know, calm. You're closer to God. It may have done it for the same reason you would do it. You get a little sun on my face for a few days and do nothing, think. And while he's there, a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came, and she's crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed, and she's suffering terribly." And so she calls him Son of David, which is David was a king, and so she's calling him king when she calls him Son of David. But she's a Canaanite. She's not somebody who believes in God. She's not the God of the Bible. She's not somebody who follows God or the God of the Bible. But she needs help. Her daughter's hurting. And her daughter is, you know, Jesus, you're the only one who can fix it. Now, because she's Canaanite, I don't know, she might have worshipped at her own idols that morning. And then she hears about Jesus and he can heal people. And so she goes. Well, it says Jesus didn't answer her. He didn't answer. She said, "You got to help my daughter." He doesn't say anything. He just kind of keeps his eyes maybe on the ocean. And she's over here talking, and he doesn't even look at her. And so his disciples came and urged him, "Send her away, because she keeps crying out after us." And Jesus said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." And this is one of the first places where people have some trouble with Jesus. Now, strictly speaking, you know, just from, you know, what the Bible says and that kind of stuff, and the Messiah, which is who Jesus is, he was sent to Israel first. It always went to Israel first. Abraham comes out of Israel and blesses the whole world. Moses was a Jew from Israel, but David was a Jew from Israel. Jesus was a Jew from Israel. So what he's saying there is true. And some people think when they read it that the disciples are saying, "Get her out of here, Jesus. She's just ticking us off." And I don't think that's what they're saying. I think they're assuming that Jesus will help her, because his answer only makes sense if that's what they're saying. If they're saying she's bothering us, Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, I was only sent to the..." He's teaching them something, right? When he's saying that, you know, they're saying, "Won't you help her?" Then if they're saying, "Why don't you do something for her, Jesus?" Then it makes sense when you say, "I'm not here for her," right? So even the disciples are saying, "Jesus, you need to do something about this woman. I'm not here for her." And so you're thinking, maybe when you read it, you're taking Jesus wrong. And maybe she's thinking that too. So she comes right up to him, and she kneels in front of him, begging him, "Lord, you have to help me." And he replied, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." And it's right here where people start having the trouble with Jesus. There are some people who think that he's cruel to this woman. That he's intentionally being mean to her for whatever reason. And I should mention that the word dog in the Bible is always an insult. There's never a time when it's not an insult. I guess, I'm not sure kids would talk this way today, but you can imagine one man saying about another, "He's my dog," in a different kind. I wouldn't say it, but there might be guys who would say something like that, and it could be an affectionate thing. That's not what's going on. There's no way to take the word dog here other than an insult. It's an insult. This is like you taking your kid to Jesus, and your kid has whatever, childhood leukemia or heart disease or some terrible acne. I mean, it could be anything. And when you get to see Jesus with your kid, he says, "I'm not really here for dogs." And there's no way to take it but an insult. And some guys think that Jesus is being cruel to her. And I don't know that he is, but it certainly would have been a hard moment. There's some people who think that what Jesus is doing is testing the guys who are listening. Not so much about her, that she's there, but he's trying to test the people who are listening. Because a lot of the people who were listening would have been Jews, the ones who were with Jesus would have been Jews, and there was a tendency with the Jews to think that they were better than everybody else. As far as religion goes, that God had spoken to them and not spoken to other people, and so we're going to do it ourselves. Christians can do that too. That's what people do. Republicans and Democrats can do it. People do it. You constantly think that what you think is the right thing, and everybody else disagrees, and so maybe he's challenging them there. You know, if that's what you think, well, that's the natural outworking of that worldview, right? If I'm only here for you guys, she's a dog. I got nothing for her. Man, that's possible. But I think he's testing her. I think he's testing her. I don't know why he's testing her like this, but I think he's challenging her. I think he wants to see how badly she wants this. And she responds. She says, well, yes, Lord, that's true. However, even the dogs, she says, can eat the crumbs that fall off the master's table. And Jesus says to her, woman, you've got great faith. It's one of the few times he says that to anybody. You've got great faith. He doesn't say it to Peter, not that I can find. He never says it to any of the disciples, but he tells this woman, you've got great faith. And it's because she hangs in there, right? She won't give up. She won't give up. If she does anything else, her daughter doesn't get healed. If she blows up at Jesus like I might have done, listen, who do you think you're calling a dog? If she blows up at him, if she cusses at him or throws a big fit, her daughter probably doesn't get healed. If she just walks out in tears, I can't believe he insulted. I've never been so insulted in my life. She just walks out in tears, her daughter probably doesn't get healed. It only happens if she stays humble. It only happens if she stays small. And Jesus says, you got great faith. What a chance she takes. You can picture the longer she's there, and Jesus has already kind of cut her down twice, that people are starting to murmur. It's getting uncomfortable. Woman, don't you see what's going on? He's not going to help. But she won't quit. And Jesus ultimately is impressed with that. Whatever his motive was at the beginning, and it never tells us, you just got to guess, he's impressed at the end. You've got great faith. And he does what she wants. Because she hangs in there, because she stays. I read one commentator who assumes that she was poor because she comes by herself. There's no husband. Maybe she was a single mom, or maybe she didn't have a husband who supported what she wanted, or maybe if they're idol worshipers, the husband may not even wanted to go to Jesus. He may not even been interested in going to Jesus. What's he going to do? Some faith healer. So some who assume that she's poor, but she may not have been. She may have been fabulously wealthy. It doesn't tell us anything about how much money she has. And in some ways, it's kind of interesting to think to me that she was a person who had some wealth, had a little bit of means. Because if you have money, somewhere deep down, you know that there's some things that money can't do. If my kid gets really sick, money can get them the best doctors, but ultimately, money can't fix those kinds of things. All the money in the world, and your kid is the one hooked up to tubes and hoses, and you're just going to feel powerless. You're going to realize there's some things that all of you, in all of your strength, you can't do. And that's where this woman gets to. And that's why she hangs in. Jesus, you just got to help me. Jesus, you just got to help me. When he calls her a dog, we are just dust and ashes. We're just made of mud. If God doesn't owe us anything. And great faith stays teachable. It stays humble. It keeps coming back. And that kind of faith opens God's heart. And it changes you too. We think about God as the artist again. It's that kind of faith that allows God to mold you and make you after his will. We talked a week ago about being authentic. The next step with that is to be teachable. And they're kind of the same thing. A person who is teachable is open to new information. And we all like to think that we're open to new information, but most people aren't. Most people already pretty much have the answer before you start talking. And if you don't believe that, look at any social media account on anything, right? Most people think they know all the answers before we ever get into a conversation. But a teachable person wants to learn. They know there's certain things they can't do. They're willing to ask for help. They're willing to ask for directions. I was watching a TV show that quoted had a Walt Whitman quote in it, be curious, not judgmental. And a teachable person is curious. They're not quick to judge. They try to understand what the other person's saying. We need more curious people in America today. People who are curious why the Republicans or the Democrats don't agree with me. Curious why people who have more money or less money or live in this state or this state are different than me, and why they think like they think and why they do what they do. We need to have more people who are asking questions, who don't think they already know all the answer. A person who is curious is willing to leave their comfort zone. A person who's teachable will take some chances and risks. They're willing to fail. If you're teachable, Thomas Edison had more than 8,000 failures getting to the light bulb. 8,000 different experiments that didn't work out. And he was asked about it once. How did you handle all that failure? And his answer was something along the lines of, they weren't failures, they were education. I know 8,000 ways not to make a light bulb. And people who are teachable take that kind of attitude. I guess conversely, people who are unteachable, they don't read, they don't study, they don't take notes. They don't assume that they can get anything out of whatever anybody else is saying. They're pretty quickly judgmental. They're defensive. And they can hide it sometimes, the defensive thing. Like you could tell somebody, hey, have you ever considered this? Like they toss out their opinion. You say, well, have you considered maybe it's not that way? They'll say, if they're trying to hide it, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. But, and then they'll tell you again why they want to do what they want to do. They never bend on anything. People who are unteachable, they talk, but they don't listen to what other people have to say. Unteachable people are, Rick Warren said that pride at its root is just insecurity. I'm scared that people will see that I don't know. I'm scared they'll see that I'm weak or that I don't have the answers. I'm scared they'll see that I'm small and I can't figure stuff out. And so pride makes you swell up. Refuse to cave into any of that. Refuse to let anybody see that you're weak or that you have any problems or that you have any weakness. You don't want them to know that you're struggling. Elliot Aronson, and I've quoted this to the worship band, and I've mentioned it before to in a sermon too, I think. Elliot Aronson was a psychologist in the 60s, and he discovered something called what he called the pratfall effect. And it's that if you see somebody who you think of as pretty competent about whatever it is, and they make a mistake of some sort, it makes you like them more. And it works in almost every field. If you buy a ticket for some musical act that you want to go watch, I don't know what act you would buy a ticket for, but think of whatever band that is that you cared enough about that you would buy a ticket for. Chris, what would you go buy a ticket for? Justin Bieber, right? So you'd go see him. So you're going to see Justin Bieber and you're in the front row. You spend extra money to go to the front row. Or Gabe back in the back. It's Gabe's birthday today. Yeah, please. There you go. Yeah. He did it. He made it. There you go. But Gabe this week, I introduced Gabe to a name he had never heard before. Willie Nelson. I feel like I failed as a teacher and a leader that he had been here with us for so many years already and didn't know. We may take a trip and just listen to Always on My Mind and stuff like that. But you pay for something like that, right? And it's the musician that you want to hear, and they get on stage, and it's their most famous song, whatever that is, and they're singing their most famous song, and they forget the words. And they kind of step back at the microphone and they go, I can't believe I sang it a million times. And it actually makes you like them more that they messed up. You know, the big executive at the office who always has the answers to everything. He's always in control. And he shows up for the meeting and he's got an ink spot on his shirt where his pen went through. It actually makes you like them more, that they're human, right? That they're just like us in some ways. And you make allowances for it. Now, if you already don't respect them, it doesn't work that way. And you see that sometimes in how the media covers people. If the media already thinks that the politician is a moron and they do something dumb, it just reinforces the moron narrative, right? But if they think the person who did it is really smart and they make some little, oh, isn't that cute? Obama did that crazy thing. Isn't that weird? And they don't make anything of it at all. It actually makes you like them more when they make their little mistake, whatever it is. You know, the weird part about pride is we're scared of letting up for even a minute where people could see that we're not all that we claim to be. But people actually are drawn to you when you're just normal. Doesn't mean that you just give up on trying to be better, but it's okay to be normal. It's okay to be human. Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message translation of the Bible, talked about that. He says, success is an unbiblical burden stupidly assumed by prideful persons who reject risk and perils of faith, preferring to appear right rather than to appear human. It's okay to let up just a little, to admit you don't have all the answers, to ask a lot of questions, to not always be the last word. I will get into something. I debated about getting into something in second service. I didn't think it went well first service. We'll see how it goes second. If you're watching online, this might be a good time to get a beverage. Come back, and I'll be done here in just a second. I had somebody ask me a question over the last week that I really hadn't thought about very much. They asked me, does it bug you if I say good job after the sermon, or hey, I really like that? Does that bug you when I do that? And it doesn't. I like it. More of it, please, I said. I was kind of joking around. Let's hear more. And he said, the reason why I'm asking, he says, is because I know it does bother some people. Like you can get a big head about it, like it can stuff your pride. And so then I started thinking about it, right? I started thinking about that sort of thing. I don't want you to feel weird about telling me if I do a good job, because there are people, God love them, who will tell me if I don't do a good job. So it's good to hear occasionally on the other side. If it goes well, don't lie to me. But if it's going okay, it's okay to say. But I started thinking about that thing. Does it work on me? The first church I was at was a bigger church, and it was growing really fast, and I was the youth minister at that, so I was getting invited to speak at things for youth a lot. Camps and retreats, and I was doing more and more of it. And it was neat to be in demand. It was neat to have people call and say, can you come and talk to us at this church, or can you come and talk to us at this retreat? Sure, I'll try to work you in. It just felt good, right? Like I was so in demand, and people wanted to hear me. And then we moved to California. Of course, nobody knew who we were there, and it wasn't the biggest church in town where we were at in California, and less people wanting me to come talk, and less people want me to, and I remember thinking about that less, and being less in demand, and it hurt a little. I want to be a big deal, and when I'm not a big deal, I guess today, if I was a younger man today, I'd probably start my own YouTube channel or something like that, so I could become a big deal, because I think this notion of being a big deal is a universal notion, right? In something. Now, you may not be in your thing. It may not be in your thing that your thing may be different than mine. Like you may be only be a big deal as, I had a friend who wanted to be a big deal in the rodeo. I never cared about that at all, but he wanted to be a big deal in that. And your thing may be different than mine, but whatever it is, I want to be a big deal in that. And if I'm not a big deal, then it means that I've failed somehow, or I'm not. It was just a weird conversation. Because then I find myself talking to this guy about it. I don't want to tell him not to say anything, like don't ever compliment me again. That you get behind me. I don't want that, because we had once in Tennessee. I'm getting off track. Just bear with me. We had in Tennessee once. I was preaching, and we were right on the interstate. Our church in Tennessee was, and I was preaching there. And a church, it was a black church from Louisville, and they were passing through our town in Tennessee, and they came into our church, this whole van. And our church was mostly a white church. We were mostly a white church. And so this whole group, and I dressed like this then, and they all were like, you could see them, suits, and the ladies had on hats, and they came from a church where you complimented the preacher in the sermon. Right? So I'm preaching, and I got into like the second or third thing I was saying, and somebody in that section said, "Help him, Lord." And it's the weirdest thing, right? And the more that they were, I kind of got into it. Okay, here we go. And I don't know how everybody else was, and people noticed it in the church. They're like, what got into you? And it's like, I don't know. It just felt good, because normally in a white church, it's a much more sedate reaction. It's a much more calm, pensive, and thoughtful reaction. And just so I know that I know the encouragement helps. I mean, I know I feel better when I get it. I know it means something to me, right? But this notion that could it go to my head? And the weirdest thing about doing anything right is you're intensely aware of how right you are. And I don't. So it's a hard thing, because to be teachable, I have to be appropriately small. God has to be able to get into me. I don't have it figured out yet. I don't know it all yet. They opened a building in California. It was a grand opening, and it was a huge facility, and I got invited to their grand opening thing they did. And it was only a few people got invited. Each person who worked there could invite 2 or 3 people, and I got invited. And it was really cool. They had hors d'oeuvres and different things set up. And while I was there was another guy that I knew who worked there, and he had some guests too, and we waved and talked to each other. And I saw the other guy who also went to our church, and the people who worked there were all calling this guy Smitworth. And I didn't know what that meant or what that was about, because that wasn't his name. And it's not really a nickname you'd get, Smitworth. And they're all calling him Smitworth. All of them are, including the guy who brought me. Hey, Smitworth, and they're all talking to him. And so when I had the guy who brought me, we were off to the side there. I said, hey, listen, why is everybody calling him that? I mean, what's going on? What's happening there? And he got red-faced. Like, it embarrassed him. Like, so then I knew it was a bad nickname, right? They were digging at him when they said it. And he said, well, it's just because he's a know-it-all. And so they started calling him the smartest man in the world, smartest Smitworth, S-M-I-T, smartest man in the world, smartest Smitworth. And that's how it came to be his nickname, because he had the answer for everything. And I started thinking about it. If you're writing a television show or a movie, to take a character who's a know-it-all, it's an easy person for us to laugh at. And so many comedies, it's hard to think of a comedy, in fact, that doesn't have at least one character in it that's like that. Everything from Barney Fife to Sheldon Cooper. I mean, Fred Flintstone was one of those kind of characters. It's the blowhard. Frank Burns was that way. Cliff Clavin was one of those guys. And when you'd see that guy come in, and you enjoyed it, watching it, whenever that person kind of got embarrassed. There's something in us that wants to see Smitworth, the smartest man in the world, kind of brought low, right? Well, I wonder if that's how we feel watching that, and it's an easy thing for us all to laugh about. I wonder what God thinks in heaven when he sees us down here, just dust and ashes, and we know everything. When God's in heaven and he looks down at us, and here we are in God's vantage point, and we're so important, and we can't even control, what's Jesus say? We can't make one of our hairs black or white. And we just think we're so smart, and we're just tiny. And God offers us everything, and we resist because we're so smart. I just think that I think God must shake his head at us a lot. It says in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 1, that one who's often reproved and it stiffens his neck. I like that imagery. One who's often reproved and yet remains stiff-necked. One day will be broken and it won't fix. You think about a person doing maybe a machine, and the engine's revving up really hard, and everything's really, really tight, and man, I think you're pushing it too hard, and just a little more, and you keep it, and sooner or later it's going to break. You think about a person who just refuses to give in, and they're under a bunch of weight, and they just stiffen their neck, and they're not going to, not quitting, and then something tears or something rips, and then you're not the same. That same imagery. How would God tell you something? If God wanted you to change, how would God tell you something? Now, I think God could use an audible voice for that. He's God. But I don't think, in my life at least, it normally works that way. I think God would send other people. I think you'd find yourself falling into the same holes over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. I think you'd have mornings where you woke up and you'd wonder why you did what you did yesterday. And then you'd go do it again. And you'd have those moments of clarity, just little moments where God get into your head. Why are you doing this to yourself? And you'd leave that moment of clarity and get back with your friends or back with your work or back with whatever you do and right back in the same hole. I think it would just be little blips on your radar if God was talking. And a person who's often reproved and yet remains stiff-necked, sooner or later it's going to break. And so if you really want to grow like God wants you to grow, you have to be teachable. And just a couple of tips. First, I mentioned it earlier, just be curious. You know, when you find yourself constantly in the same hole or the same conflict, start to ask questions about it. Why do they think like they do? How are they thinking? Why do they approach this so much different than I do? And try to see their side of it. Try to see, look at your own, those things where you're in the same, why do I do the things I do? And be curious. Don't assume you know all the answers. Know your limitations. Be curious first. Know your limitations. Recognize the things that you can't do. You may have all the money in the world, but there's some things you can't control. The genie in Aladdin, you can't make someone love you, no matter how much money you have. All you can do is be kind, lift them up, serve, learn to forgive. You can't, with all the money in the world, you can't control your own mortality. It's not in your hands. And you can't change how you think and how you operate like God can if he gets a hold of you. So know your limitations. Be curious, know your limitations, and decide where you want to go. Because here's the God's honest truth. If you're so scared of looking small, or so scared of failing, or so scared of taking chances, then you're never going to grow like God wants you to grow. Because all of those things, it seems like when I read the Bible, God pushes us to know those things first, to be small first so he can lift us up. Think about that early story. That's what it was. He makes that woman get small first so he can lift her up. I think that's what God wants. One last story. It's a Jesus story, and then I'm done. It's one of my favorite. In fact, it may be my favorite. It's certainly one that I quote a lot in sermons. I don't know if it's my favorite. I like it a lot. Jesus is by himself. Most of the time, he's not by himself. Most of the time when you read the Bible about Jesus, he's always, crowds are around him or his disciples. But this day, he's by himself. And it's a hot day, and he's out in the sun, and he's all by himself. And a woman comes up to him. And there's a well, and she's going to get water. And she sees Jesus there, but she ignores him. But he doesn't ignore her. He says, "Will you get me a drink?" And she, I think, doesn't even look at him. She just kind of rolls her eyes. "You're a Jewish man, and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" Because the Jews thought that the Samaritans were unclean. To even touch him would make you unclean. "I can't give you water. It'll make you unclean." You always look down on us. Now you want something. That's the attitude. And Jesus says, if you knew who was asking you for water, you'd ask me, and I'd give you water. And she says, "What are you going to draw it with? The well's deep. You've not got anything to draw the water with." He says, "If you knew who was asking you for water," he says again, "you'd ask me for water, and I would give you a spring of water that would never go dry. You'd never thirst again." And I can picture in my head her kind of chuckling under her breath at that and saying, "Well, that's the water I need. I wouldn't have to be here talking to you." And Jesus pauses and says, "I tell you what, why don't we talk about it? You'll get your husband and come back and we'll talk about it." And she says, "I don't have a husband." And he goes, "Yep, that's right. You've had 5. And the one you're with now, you're just living with him." And I imagine at this point the woman's disposition changes, because he shouldn't know that. But he does. And so she says, "I can see you're some sort of prophet." Maybe she even takes a step back. "I can see you're some sort of prophet." It would freak you out. And he says, "Maybe you're a person who cares about religious things. You Jews think we can only worship God." And she tries to change the subject. "You Jews think we can only worship God in Jerusalem, or we Samaritans think we can worship God right here on this mountain." And Jesus says, "Woman, there's going to come a time where it won't matter where you worship. You'll just be spirit and truth." God wants to introduce himself to all sorts of people, spirit and truth. And the woman's just wanting to get away here at this point. She says, "Well, maybe when the Messiah comes, he can explain this to us." And Jesus says, "Funny you should mention that." It's the same story as the other one. He just keeps needling her. He just keeps needling her. I don't know why Jesus does that. It's a quality about Jesus that's really under-advertised. But he just keeps needling her. "Why don't you get your husband? We'll talk about this thing." "Don't have a husband." "Oh, that's right. You've had 5. Just keeps picking. It's stuff you wouldn't do in polite conversation. He just keeps jabbing her. And she could walk away. She could say, "You know what?" Say some ugly word to him and walk down the hill. But she doesn't. She just stays around, curious. and because she's curious, and because she's somewhat humble, he's able to get her. We're going to go straight into communion. So if you have one of these, get it ready. You'll need it in a minute. If you don't have one, there's some on the table there in the back. I want you to think about, as we go into communion, what Jesus offers you. What Jesus offers you. And I want you to think about if you want it or not. You know, if people outside the church are saying people in the church are fake, this is your chance to decide whether you want to be one of those fake people or not. Because fake people just talk a game. They don't really let it get in. They don't think about it that hard. It's all outside, nothing inside, right? It's a good show. But the people who let it really get into them, the ones who can sing that song earlier, God, mold me, make me, change me, God. Well, then they have to be yielded, right? They've got to open their hearts up. They've got to let him get in. So, and I think God needles people. I think Jesus needles people. Go get your husband. I'm not here for dogs like you. And you know that's who you are. You know that's what you are. And just needles at you to see if you're going to hang in there or not. And some people don't. They don't like to think about how small they are. They don't like to think about how weak they are. They don't like to think about their problems. But I want you to think about it for a second. And I want you to think about those blemishes and those dark spots. I want you to think about those holes that you fall into over and over and over and over and over again. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about the stupid addictions that you get into, whether they're small, maybe as a cell phone addiction, or as big as some sort of a substance you're putting yourself through or into you too much. I want you to think about all those moments where that little voice in the back of your head, why are you doing this to yourself? And you ignored it, and those hard spots, right? Because Jesus came to turn our heart of stone into a heart of flesh. So I want you to think about all that. And I want you to hand it to him. I want you to use your imagination, and whatever those things are, God, it's yours. I want you to mold me and make me. Because every part of the Christian message takes courage. You know, it's not just about evangelism or going to be a missionary in some foreign country that takes courage. It's all of it. When Jesus tells you to turn the other cheek, there's risk in that. Because if you turn the other cheek, what might happen? You might get hit again. When you forgive somebody, what might happen? They might do it again. When you show grace to somebody, what might they do? They might take advantage. When you love somebody, what might they do? They might cheat and break your heart. They might lie. When you serve, they might take what you serve and not give you anything back. It all takes courage. So when you think about your life and those hard spots, and I want you to think about giving it to him. In your imagination, I want you to think about, Jesus, it's yours. It's all yours. And as you're handing that to him, in exchange, Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, took bread, and he broke it, and he said, this is my body given for you. Take this in remembrance of me. I want you to think about those things you're handing to him. And when you're thinking about, God, mold me, make me, change me, when you're praying that kind of prayer and you offer that to him, he'll do it. You're his masterpiece. And as you hand that to him, he hands you this cup and he says, this is my blood shed for you. Take this in remembrance of me. Amen. I only have one little announcement.